Hey guys, Pastor Alex here. And before we jump into the sermon, I just want to take a moment and say thank you so much for tuning in, watching with us today. We hope this blesses and encourages you. So enjoy the message.
We're going to jump into our verse today. We're going to be in Genesis 50. We're going to start at verse number 14. Genesis 50, 14. This is the same passage of Scripture that we read from last week. Even though we read from it last week, I'm going to read it again to give us a quick refreshing on what it says. Genesis 50, verse 14. Let's begin reading. It says, "After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers and all who went up with him to bury his father. And when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, perhaps Joseph will hate us, and he may actually repay us for all the evil that we did to him. So they sent messengers to Joseph, saying, before your father died, he commanded us, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now, please forgive the trespass of the servants of God of your father." Don't you love how they refer to themselves as the servants of God of your father after they went and sold Joseph into slavery? Please forgive the servants of God. I said, when they said this, Joseph wept when they spoke to him. And then his brothers also went and they fell down before his face and they said, behold, we are your servants. And in another translation it says, we are your slaves. And it said, Joseph said to him, he said, hey, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? I said, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about it, all of it is as it is to this day, to save many people. Now, therefore, don't be afraid. I'll provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them, and he spoke kindly to his brothers. Now, to be honest with you, I planned for last week's message to be a standalone, meaning that I didn't plan for it to have a different part. I didn't plan for it to be contained within a series, but as I began writing it, I began noticing that it was getting a little bit long, even for me. And some of you, don't laugh at that, all right? Because I know some of you, what you talk about on Sundays, he kept us in there until 12:30. What's he doing? But I noticed it was a little bit long for me because I started realizing that there was a lot that I felt like God was trying to communicate to us through the story, and I couldn't put it all into one message. And so this week, it's going to be a type of sequel from last week, whereas last week was It's All Good. This week will be part 2 of It's All Good. So in similar fashion to kind of how we did it last week, look at the person that's sitting next to you, give them last week's sermon title, and just remind them, say, it's all good. No, just pat them on the back. Yeah, it's all good. It's good. It's all good. Now, I want you now to do this. Look at that same person who just told you it was all good and ask them this question. Why in the world is it all good? That'll be our title for today's message. It's All Good, Part 2, Why in the World Is It All Good? Now, in case you missed It's All Good, Part 1, last week we talked about a guy named Joseph. Obviously, we just read that scripture. Joseph, I want to make sure in case this is maybe your first time in church or you just need a good refreshing, the Joseph we're talking about today is not the Joseph of the New Testament, the Joseph of the Christmas story who is engaged to Jesus' mother Mary. That is not the Joseph we're referring to. The Joseph we're referring to is the Joseph of the Old Testament, the one whose father loved him so much that he goes and he gives him this multicolored robe, and his brothers get so jealous at his father's display of favoritism toward Joseph that they fake his death and they sell him into Egyptian slavery. And after being in slavery for a while, this guy named Potiphar, his wife, starts lying about Joseph, and Joseph catches the raw end of these lies and ends up in prison for something that he didn't even do. And Joseph gets put in prison, and then he gets forgotten about in prison until Pharaoh starts asking around for someone who can interpret dreams, and somehow, some way, Joseph finds himself standing in front of Pharaoh interpreting one of his dreams, and when he does, he knocks it out of the park. I mean, this dude capitalizes on his opportunity. He interprets the dream, and Pharaoh is so impressed at Joseph's interpretation that he takes him in one moment from being a prisoner, literally a Hebrew slave in an Egyptian prison, and putting him over the entire country. Joseph gets the most massive promotion anyone's ever seen. And due to Joseph's leadership and his planning and his preparation, when he gets put over the country, he ends up saving hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people from a deadly famine that swept across the entire world. And this very famine is the reason that Joseph ends up connecting with his brothers after 20 plus years of not even knowing if they were alive, of them not knowing if he was alive. And then after putting them through a series of tests, Joseph then moves his brothers and their family and his father and his entire family down to Egypt to live with him. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the story of Joseph. And I'm telling you, that was impressive right now, okay? I'm not wanting to brag on myself, but I did that without looking at my notes, okay? You get up here and try and do that without looking at your notes. I could see the teleprompter going in my head that entire time trying to tell you that story. So, all that to get you to our spot in the story of where we're at today. Because when we arrive in our scripture from just now, Joseph's family has been living in Egypt. They've already moved to Egypt, and they've been living there for 17 years. But unfortunately, Joseph's father, Jacob, has just passed away. And when he does, his brothers just kind of assume, well, now that dad's gone, Joseph is going to seek out revenge on us for how awful we were to him. So in a last-ditch effort, they approach Joseph and they seek to remind him that, hey, right before Dad left, or right before Dad passed away, like it was that, you remember when you had to go out into the hallway and get that drink of water and you weren't in there? Yeah, when you left, he told us this thing, and he told us to remind you to forgive us for how bad we were. You didn't hear it, but he said, be sure to tell Joseph, forgive your brothers for being so bad. And so they're trying to save themselves from all this. And Joseph hears it. And last week we talked about Joseph's response when he hears that, because essentially, even after all the pain and turmoil and angst that his brothers caused him to experience throughout his life, Joseph looks at his brothers and essentially he just says, chill, it's all good. It's all good. You're good. I'll let you off the hook. Don't worry about it. And he says this tweetable quote. He says, the evil that you tried to weave against me, God took that evil and he rewove it for my good. Ooh. He says this, and his brothers are surprised. And then when we fast forward to the New Testament and we arrive thousands of years later, we find the Apostle Paul nearly saying the exact same thing in the middle of some of his darkest moments, experiencing very similar circumstances, being thrown in jail wrongfully, being beaten, being lied about, being betrayed. And Paul comes into the Roman church, and in Romans 8:28, he says this to remind us. He goes, we know. He doesn't say we hope. He says we know that God causes everything. Not some things, not most things, but every single thing to work together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And so last week, we took some of that content to discuss how, number one, God isn't the source behind every single thing that happens in your life. And we can say that with confidence, and I know that's different for some people in here, but we can say that with confidence because God isn't the author of evil. And God doesn't cause you to sin. Sin is the opposite of what God would want. Sin is disobeying God. And God doesn't cause evil. Therefore, we can know that not everything that happens because God made it happen, because evil happens and sin happens, all right? Now, that's encouraging. But we also figured out last week, number two, that if we don't walk by faith when things get dark, then we're not walking by faith at all. Because faith is the ability to say it's all good even when we have no idea how it's all going to play out and how it's all going to be good. That's faith. Faith isn't saying it's all good after the fact. Faith is saying it's all good even when I don't see the answer. And last week we talked about how encouraging these promises from God are toward us, because no matter what our circumstance looks like now, if we love him, and if we are called according to his purpose for our life, then all those promises apply to us. They don't just apply to me. They don't just apply to the most churchy, cool leader, whatever, the people that you have elevated in your mind that you think God's going to come through for them every time. No, every one of those promises about God working everything out for our good, It applies to every single one of us, all right? We talked about that stuff. But there's still one thing we didn't discuss, okay? We discussed the fact that Joseph said it was all good. And we discussed how important it is for all of us to arrive to the conclusion in our own lives that it's all good. But we never talked about why in the world it is actually all good. We never discussed how Joseph can look at his brothers that caused him so much pain and so much hurt and put him through everything that they put him through and was able to say, it's all good. So today, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about why in the world is it all good? Why was it all good for Joseph, and how it can be all good for us as well. Now, I'd venture to say that sitting in here, every single one of us can, if we put our all into it and get really brutally honest, I'd venture to say that all of us can recall moments in our life where we felt like they were awful and we didn't want to go through them and they hurt in the moment, but how long-term God worked it out for our good. It's the moment where you lost that job and the enemy tried to come at your bank account. The enemy tried to get you scared and to get you walking in fear, but then a little while later, God turned that lost job into an even better job down the road. Most of us have experienced things like that. It's like when you went through that nasty breakup that was so hard and you couldn't eat afterwards, and you're getting sick to your stomach, and you don't want to get on Facebook or Instagram because you see that person's picture and it just makes you mad, and you want to talk about them, and then you go through all that, and it's terrible, but then like a few weeks later, you end up meeting the person that you married. A few months later, a few years later, you end up getting introduced to the person that you spend the rest of your life with. And then speaking of our married couples in here, it's the times when you're yelling at each other, and you're fighting, and you're saying things that you shouldn't say, and you're stomping, and you're throwing stuff, and you're doing it in front of the kids, and you know you're not supposed to be doing it in front of the kids, but you're doing it in front of the kids anyways because you're so mad, and you're like, God, the enemy is trying to break up my marriage, I don't know, and then 1 hour later, that fight results in the best make-up sex that you and your spouse have had in literally a year. Don't get weird on me, all right? Y'all were way more responsive just then. Y'all don't have to get weird on me, okay? Sex isn't evil. If you've been told sex is evil, you were told a lie. That is literally heresy. God created sex. It is good, and he talks about it all the time in his word. He's not ashamed about it. You don't have to be ashamed about it either. And if he talks about it in his word, by God, we're going to talk about it in church. So get ready. Now, that's not what we're talking about today, so let me fast forward real quick. We could go on. We could continue talking about that, but we'll have that moment. We got a relationship series coming up soon, so you guys get ready for that one. PG-13. It's going to be a lot of fun. Now, quickly, just by a show of hands, how many of you in here are honest enough to say that you've experienced God taking a really awful situation and turning it around for your good at long run, by a show of hands? All right, perfect. I love that. Now, here's the problem with what just happened. Not everybody's hand just went up in this room, all right? And there are only 2 reasons why your hand did not go up just then. Reason number 1, if your hand didn't go up just then, is because you are so boring and lame that you won't even lift up your hand in church. And if that's the case, get it together, all right? We got to fix that. It's not who we are. Overflow is, if you haven't already noticed it, we're not boring. There's nothing we do that's boring. Now, I don't think that's probably the case for most people in here. And so with that gets me to point number 2. The reason that some of us didn't raise our hands just then is because somewhere down deep in our heart, we truly believe that we haven't experienced God take even one bad situation and turn it around for our good. But if that's the case, if that's really the case, then I want us to stop, because we got to get one thing clear really fast, okay? It's God's responsibility to work everything for your good, but it's your responsibility to acknowledge it when he does. He's going to take care of all that on the back end. That's his job. That's not your job to worry about that. Oh, but it is your job to say thank you when it happens. He kind of expects that from us when he does something good, when he gives us a present, when he comes through for us. Just like you would expect someone to say thank you for doing something for them, God expects the same thing for us, man. I can guarantee you, God's come through for most of us probably thousands of times, and we never even stopped to just say thanks and actually mean it because his answer to our prayer didn't look like what we thought it should have looked like. Man, thank goodness for his mercy and his grace and his patience with us. Because without it, he would have been done with our ungrateful selves a long time ago. So before we go forward with this message, can we stop and just thank God for how good he's been? Come on. If God's been better to you than you deserve, would you let him know it overflowed? Doesn't that feel so good? Just saying thank you, being grateful, just letting your guard down and admitting that, yeah, that season sucked, but man, God really did use it. He really did work it together for my good. I wonder sometimes why in the world it's so hard for us to admit that. Like, why can we go through all that hard stuff and make it to the end and see God work everything together for our good and yet still struggle to say, it's all good when it's happened? Still struggle to say, oh man, you did that. That happened. I wonder why in the world that's so tough. But then when I begin reading the story of Joseph, I am reminded about why that is so tough. And the reason, and it's hard, because recognizing all the good that came from the painful, agonizing seasons of life, it requires a few things, all right? Number one, it requires time. Joseph showed us that, okay? He had to literally wait 40 plus years to see how God would work everything out together for his good. And at the end of that time, he was able to look back and say, you know what? He worked everything out. It's all good. This is great. But then number two, it requires a deep sense of faith and trust in God. Because when we get to the New Testament, like we said, Paul, in the middle of his dark days, he doesn't have to wait until God's worked everything out for him. In the middle of being imprisoned wrongfully and beaten and all that different stuff, he says, I know that God's going to work everything out together for my good. So it requires time sometimes, I get it. It requires a deep sense of trust and a deep sense of faith in God, but there's still one more requirement. And Joseph, he models this requirement for us, and he shows us what the most important factor toward us becoming people who can, in the face of any situation, say and believe it's all good. And you want to know what that factor is that Joseph shows us? Forgiveness. Say that with me. Just say forgiveness. One more time. Say forgiveness. How'd you say it? Because when you start getting into a sermon about forgiveness, all the walls start going up. Everyone's like, you're not talking to me. I don't want to hear this. This is not good. This hurts. So that's what we're going to be talking about that today. And so I just kind of wanted you to say it to kind of go ahead and smooth you out and get ready for some of this because it's going to apply to every single person in here, all right? Forgiveness. And it's one of the qualities that I most admire about Joseph in this story. Look back at verses 18 through 21. This is what Joseph says to his brothers in this moment. He says, then his brothers went and fell down before his face, and they said, behold, we're your servants, or like we said earlier, we're your slaves. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Like, sure, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for my good, in order to bring it about as it is to this day to save a whole bunch of people. Now, therefore, don't be afraid. It's all good. I'll provide for you and for your little ones. And he comforted them, and he spoke kindly to them. And see, when Joseph responds to his brothers in this way, after they've offered to be his slaves, and he responds to him, and he says, no, am I in the place of God? Am I the one to do that? What he's saying is, I forgive you. In fact, what he's saying to them is, I've already forgiven you. He's saying, yeah, you did me wrong, and you don't deserve my forgiveness, but I'm over it. I'm not going to focus on everything you did. I'm just going to focus on everything that God has done. I love how Joseph shifts his focus here. We see it. He says, I could focus on all the evil that you meant against me, but instead I'm going to focus on all the good that God brought that for me. Man, sometimes we get so focused on how mean people have been to us that we completely miss how good God has been to us through this entire process. And so instead of putting his focus on that, Joseph begins to put his focus on all that God's done for him. And I can promise you our lives would be 100 times better if we could begin shifting our focus from what people have done to us to what God has done to us. If some of you could quit focusing on how bad your parents were, and you could start focusing on how good God was and seeing you through it all. If some of you could quit replaying all the mean things that they said about you, and you could start meditating and learning and memorizing all the good things that God has said about you. If some of us could quit complaining and quit noticing and quit focusing on how bad our boss was and how unfair our boss was, and if we could start focusing on how unfair the cross was whenever it happened, man, our lives, I promise you, we'd gain a whole nother perspective. They'd be a lot easier, but unfortunately, a lot of times we get so wrapped up and distracted by how mean people have treated us that we're completely blinded to how good God has been treating us, all right? You need to know this concerning bitterness and unforgiveness. Bitterness is blinding. Bitterness seeks to steal your sight. I've seen it 1,000 times, and I've been there, all right? Where we get so mad and we hold on to that bitterness and that resentment, and we hold it so close, and we refuse to let it go, and we let it linger, and we let it fester in there, and God is asking us to forgive, but we don't want to forgive. That even though God has been working things out for our good this entire time, we've been blind to it because we're so focused on how mean they were and how they unfriended us and what she said to me and how they treated me, and we can't even see what's happening. Look, if bitterness has a presence in your life, then you will be blinded to God's presence in your life. Bitterness is blinding. Bitterness is going to steal your sight. And whether Joseph was entrenched in bitterness at some point in his life or not, we can assume that he probably is. But whether he was or not, we can clearly see that at this point in his life, Joseph isn't a slave to unforgiveness. And the reason I say the word slave right here is because when Joseph's brothers approach him and they assume that things aren't all good, and they assume that Joseph is seeking revenge, and they assume that he hasn't forgiven him, then they offer themselves up to Joseph as slaves. Now, humanly speaking, Joseph had every right to accept that offer. I think if there's anything those brothers deserved, it's to be a slave to that guy that you sold into slavery and that you put through all that pain. Literally, that's the Old Testament. Eye for an eye, go get revenge on your enemies. Joseph had every right to accept that offer and make those boys his slaves, but in refusing to enslave his brothers and in offering them forgiveness instead and saying it's all good, Joseph was also refusing to enslave himself. Because what I feel like Joseph had learned already through all of his years in the prison and through all of his years working for Potiphar is that the only person that your bitterness enslaves is you. Yes. You are the only person that gets held hostage to what's happening in here. You're the only person that gets held hostage to the unforgiveness that you're letting begin to creep up in your heart. Let me show it to you. Let me prove it to you. You're going to love this. Matthew 18, verses 21 through 35. We're going to read a little bit here, but it's good. All right, Matthew 18, 21 through 35. This is Peter. He says, Peter came to Jesus and he asked, Lord, how often should I forgive somebody who sins against me? 7 times? Jesus replies, no, not 7 times, but 70 times 7 times. Therefore, and he goes into a parable here about forgiveness. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who decided to bring his accounts up to date with servants who had borrowed money from him. In the process, one of his debtors was brought in who owed him millions, say millions. He owed him millions of dollars, but he couldn't pay, so his master ordered that he be sold along with his wife, his children, and everything he owned in order to pay the debt. But the man fell down before his master and he begged him, please be patient with me, I'll pay it all. Well, then his master was filled with pity for him, and so he released him and he forgave his debt. But when the man left the king, he went to a fellow servant who only owed him a few $1,000s. He grabbed him by the throat and demanded instant payment. His fellow servant fell down before him and he begged for just a little bit more time. He said, please be patient with me, I'll pay it. But his creditor wouldn't wait. He had the man arrested and he put him in prison until the debt could be paid in full. And when the other servants saw this, they were upset. So they went to the king and they told him everything that happened. And the king called in the man that he'd forgiven. And he said, you evil servant, I forgave you that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you show mercy to your fellow servant like I had mercy on you? Then the angry king sent the man to prison to be tortured until he paid his entire debt. And that's what the Heavenly Father will do to you if you refuse to forgive your brothers and your sisters from your heart. The master in this story, he expects the servant who has experienced this unearned, undeserved forgiveness to just naturally extend that same kind of unearned, undeserved forgiveness. But that's not what happens. He ends up going to the guy that he should have forgiven, and he ends up putting him in prison for all that stuff. But when that happens, at the end of the story, the guy that the evil servant put in prison isn't the one that ends up in prison. At the end of the story, the evil servant is the one that actually ends up in prison, because bitterness, it's a self-inflicted prison sentence. He's the one that ended up locked up in prison, not the guy he was mad at. Bitterness is when you go and you put yourself in prison. Bitterness is like, and many of you have probably heard this before, bitterness is like drinking poison and expecting it to hurt somebody else. Of course, we would never do that, but that's what bitterness is. Look, the only person that our unforgiveness hurts is us. We're the only people who feel that pain. We're the ones that are staying up late at night. We're the ones that get mad when we get on Facebook. We're the ones that can't eat, or we're the ones that binge eat whenever it happens. The only person that is affected and that is hurt by your unforgiveness is you. It'll hold you back from all that God has for your life. Remember, man, if Joseph had still been holding that grudge against his brothers when they showed up in Egypt, he would have never had the opportunity to save his family and more than likely the entire nation of Israel. Let's not forget, Israel as a people group, as a nation, as a country, their entire history moving forward hinged upon Joseph's willingness to walk in forgiveness. And it's no different with you. Your family's future is dependent upon your willingness to forgive. Your mental health and your joy and your peace and your ability to get good sleep, it hinges upon your willingness to be able to walk in forgiveness. You stepping into your full potential in God, and you stepping into the purpose and plan that God has for your life. It is completely dependent on whether or not you are willing to let some things go, to move on, and to look at those people that hurt you and say, it's all good. Dude, it's important, man. Your future is wrapped up in this. Your destiny, your purpose and plan that God has for you, it's wrapped up in you being able to say, it's all good. Look at Genesis chapter number 41, verse number 51. Genesis 41, 51. It says, Joseph named his older son Manasseh, for he said, God's made me forget all my troubles and everyone in my father's family, all that's behind me. And then it says, Joseph then named his second son Ephraim, for he said, God has made me fruitful in this land of my grief. Now, if you pay really close attention, these two boys' names preach a sermon all on their own. First, Joseph had Manasseh, which means God's made me forget all that pain and all that stuff I endured back then. I'm over it. I'm past it. And it's a picture of where Joseph was at that point in his life. All that stuff happened to him, but that was behind him. He's forgotten about that, and he's moved on. And then he has another boy, and he names him Ephraim, which means God has made me fruitful. Through the names of these two sons, I believe God is communicating to us that if Manasseh or forgiveness is birthed first, then he will pave the way for Ephraim or fruitfulness to follow closely after. It's this idea that the forgiveness that you plant in one season shows up as fruitfulness in the next season. It's this idea that if you would plant forgiveness here and you'd sow forgiveness here, that when you get over here, you'll reap healing on the other side of what you planted over there. It's this idea that forgiveness now equals joy then. Forgiveness now equals peace then. You getting it? Forgiveness now equals blessing and favor then. But if you refuse to sow forgiveness now, then don't anticipate blessing and favor coming then, because Manasseh always has to be born before Ephraim. Don't expect to walk into the land of favor and blessing without first having walked through the process of forgiveness. Forgiveness always has to come first. One of my old pastors, he tweeted, or he posted this on Facebook last night. He said, you can't outpray the seeds that you planted. This is what he's saying. You plant seeds of unforgiveness and bitterness and anger right here. Don't matter how hard you pray. God, bless my finances. God, bless my family. God, do this for me. You can't outpray the seeds that you planted. If you plant those seeds here, that's what you're reaping over here. All right? But if you plant the seeds of forgiveness here, over here you reap a whole lot of other way better stuff. All right? You can't outpray the seeds that you planted in that season. Forgiveness is a process. You can't experience the land of blessing without walking through the process of forgiveness. And the reason that I say process is because that's exactly what forgiveness is. It's not always an overnight thing. You don't always just get to say, oh, you're forgiven, you walk away. Sometimes, and you've experienced it, we all know it, forgiveness is a process. That's why when Peter asked Jesus, how many times should I forgive him? 7 times? Jesus, he said, no, boy, you're going to have to forgive him 70 times, 7 times. He's like, I know you, Peter. I know this 7 times isn't going to be enough. You're going to have to forgive him over and over and over. You may have to forgive him 490 times before you can ever look at him and honestly say and believe that it's all good. It's a process. I remember as a youth pastor, I had a family that moved to our city and they started attending our church. And the reason that they actually moved there is because the husband in that family, the father in that family, had an affair on his wife, but he was a pastor in another town, and so it was kind of like a really well-known thing that happened, and their family was in turmoil. They were shattered by it, but his wife didn't leave. She wanted to stick it out and you know, see their marriage last, and it did, and they're thriving right now. But when they got to Hamilton, where I was youth pastoring, that's the girl that I inherited in my youth group, a girl who had just gone through that and who was incredibly angry with her father, who was her father who she had considered her role model for so many years, the person that could do no wrong. He goes and he does this, and now she can't even look at him. She's mad at him. She's angry with him. She doesn't want to talk to him. She can't let it go. And then one night at some point, I don't know if it was a message I preached or if a message that someone else preached, but she hears a sermon on forgiveness. And so what she goes and does is she takes a chair and she goes out to her garage with nobody else around. And she sits that chair down and she imagines her father sitting in that chair. He's not out there, but she imagines her father sitting in the chair. And she looks at him and she gives it to him. I mean, she says everything that she wanted to say. She was cussing at him, something she'd never do to her own dad, like in real life. She's cussing, she's mad. She's giving it to him exactly the way that she wanted to give it to him. She gets it all out of her system. And she looks at him, the imaginary dad that's sitting in the chair. And she says, I forgive you. I forgive you. I forgive you. And she had to keep doing it because it didn't take the first time. And she had to keep saying, I forgive you. And she had to keep saying, I forgive you. And she had to keep forgiving him. And then eventually, she started believing that she was forgiving him. And then eventually, she started meaning that she was forgiving him. And then eventually, the power of God falls in her garage. And this is her story. She told me, the power of God falls in her garage because he's so pleased at the forgiveness that's happening that 2 hours later, the girl gets up off of the garage floor after weeping under the presence of the Lord that filled that place. She gets up off the floor. She grabs that chair. She goes, she puts it up, and she never walked in bitterness toward her dad one more day because she had to walk through the process of forgiveness. Now, that process, it may not happen that quickly for you. Okay, it happened for her in 2 hours. That's awesome. For some of you, it may take 2 years, though. But you gotta start the journey now. You gotta go for it. It's one of the most important things that you're probably ever going to do. For some of you, that may be really beneficial. You may need to go find a chair today, sit it in some room, forgive somebody. Obviously, some of you hear this, and that's not how you want it to happen. Because how you want it to happen is you want to go to that person face to face. You want to cuss them out to their face. And you want to tell them how you really feel. And you want to say it right there in person. For some of you, you want that confrontation, but you don't want it directly. You just want to go to Facebook Messenger and you want to write this long message and tell them how bad they were and all the stuff they did to you and how mad you were and how you didn't deserve that. And then at the very end say, but I forgive you. That's how we want to do it. Oh, you're so bad. You're awful. I forgive you. That's what we want to do. That's not what needs to happen, though. Okay, for some of you, you need to go get a letter. You need to write it all out. Everything that you want to say, then rip it up and never send it. Because forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. Forgiveness doesn't require an apology. It doesn't require a face-to-face encounter, man. Sometimes that's not an option. You got to remember, Joseph walked in forgiveness long before he even knew his brothers were still alive. He forgave his brothers before they even showed up in Egypt. When they showed up, they were already forgiven. Dude, sometimes reconciliation isn't an option anyways. Sometimes that person's passed away. Sometimes that person is remarried, and if they are, don't go talk to them, okay? Let me give you a little advice here. Don't go reach out to them. You don't need to do that. It's inappropriate. And sometimes that person's just not ready for it. And you know what? That's okay. Because the only person responsible for forgiveness taking place in your heart is you. You are the only one responsible for what's happening in here. Your daddy's not responsible for it. Your mommy's not responsible for it. Your ex isn't responsible for it. Your bad friends that left you and talked bad about you and said all that mean stuff on Facebook about you, they're not responsible for it. You are responsible for the forgiveness that needs to take place in your heart. You don't need an apology. You don't need to talk to him at all. It's all on you. And forgiveness, it's not a suggestion. I want to remind us, like, it's not this self-help thing, like, oh, if you're struggling in here and you need to, you need to start growing or whatever, then maybe you should think about forgiving somebody that's holding you back. That's not how it works. Forgiveness isn't a suggestion. It's an expectation. If you're a believer, if you really claim to be a follower of Jesus, forgiveness isn't just something you should do. It's something that you have to do. You don't have a choice. And it's not just to help you. It's so that you can maintain right standing with God. If you're harboring bitterness, you're not right with God. That's what the Bible says. Let me prove it to you. Matthew 6:14. This is Jesus talking to his disciples. If you forgive those who sin against you, your heavenly Father will forgive you. But if you refuse to forgive others, then your heavenly Father won't forgive your sins either. As a believer, forgiveness is not something you should do. It's something you have to do. Forgiveness is a requirement. It's a divine expectation given to us by God himself. Came out of the mouth of Jesus. But just because it's a requirement and just because it's an expectation, that doesn't mean it's going to come easy. God never said forgiveness was going to be easy. In fact, forgiveness might be one of the hardest things that you ever do, especially depending on the situation. Because see, it's one thing to forgive that person for unfriending you on Facebook or for, I don't know, saying that mean thing to you or for being rude to you in person or for not coming to your house and help you move whenever you needed their help, okay? It's one person, or it's one thing to forgive someone for that, but it begins to get a lot tougher when things like death and abuse and adultery get involved. But even still, it's not easy, but it's still a requirement. And I can promise you this, not only is it a requirement, it's worth it. Anybody in here agree? Just by a show of hands, you've forgiven somebody, say forgiveness is worth it. Forgiveness is worth it every single time. For some of us in here, we need to be able to get to the place where we can say it's all good and mean it to those people who said those things that they shouldn't have said, and those people that did those things that they shouldn't have done, and to those people who treated us how they shouldn't have treated us. We got to be able to get to that spot, and that's probably concerning all of us. I bet every single one of us in here can think of one person that we need to extend some forgiveness to. But it doesn't stop there. Because for some of us, the person that we need to forgive isn't even really a human at all. For some of us, the person that we need to forgive is God himself. Because we've been holding God accountable for things in our life that happened and things in our life that didn't happen. And if you're there, and if that's you and you know you're holding God accountable for that stuff, know that you're never going to be able to progress in your journey with God and in his purpose for your life until you get that taken care of. But I also want you to know that God isn't mad at you. God's not up there just angry at the fact that you're angry with him. No, God still loves you, and he wants you to make it. And he still has good plans for your life, but you never get to step into those plans until you begin to walk in forgiveness. And see, while all of us more than likely have people that we need to forgive, and while some of us need to walk and step into forgiveness as it concerns God himself, there's a third individual that my best bet says that a lot of us need to forgive. I came here today to say that somebody in this room needs to leave here and go find a mirror and look at yourself and say it's all good. Because you've been holding yourself in captivity towards some of the mistakes that you made in your past. The mistakes that affected your marriage. The mistakes that affected your friends. The mistakes that affected your family. You need to be able to look at yourself and say it's all good and offer yourself the same grace and mercy that God has already offered you. You got to remember, man, this promise that God's going to work all things together for our good, it doesn't just apply to you. It applies to the people that you hurt as well. Oh, and that's a good thing, because I'm sure all of us can look back and say, well, I treated them like garbage. But thank goodness, because God's not just going to work everything out for our good. He's going to work everything out for their good. He's going to work everything out for your kids' goods. He's going to work everything out for your coworkers' goods. He's going to work everything out for the good, for all those friends that you ran off because of how bad of a friend that you were. He's going to work it out for all of those goods, man. That same promise applies to them. You got to remember, Joseph's brothers, they were the bad guys in the story, and yet God still worked everything out for their good too. Oh, that's good news for some of us, man. But you know, I'm convinced that the reason that most of us struggle so hard with forgiveness is because we identify with the wrong character in this story. See, when we read the story of Joseph, we identify with Joseph. We identify with the guy who was done wrong. We identify with the hero. We identify with the guy who God is going to use to save the world and to save his family. But that's not the case. Within the story of Joseph, we're not Joseph. We're the brothers. We're the evil ones. We're the villains. We're the ones who betrayed it. Within the story of Joseph, man, we're awful, all right? We're not Joseph. Within that story, Jesus is Joseph, man. Jesus is the one that we betrayed. Jesus is the one that our evil actions caused him all sorts of pain. And Jesus is also the one who, like Joseph, was put into the prison. Jesus was put into the pit. And then a little while later, he emerged as royalty in order to save us from the spiritual famine that was taking place within our own lives. We're not the heroes in this story. We're the villains. We're Potiphar's wife. We're the brothers. We are the cupbearer who left Joseph rotting in prison. And Jesus is Joseph. Jesus is the one who said, yeah, you didn't deserve it, but I forgive you anyways. It's all good. Can we stand up on our feet today and just give God a little thank you praise for how good he's been to every single one of us? Last week, we were reminded about God's promise that he's going to work everything out for our good. And so what we did in response is we took a moment to declare to our situations that it's all good. But today, we're reminded of God's love and his forgiveness. And so today, we're not going to look at our situations and offer up an it's all good. Today, for most of us, we need to go and look at some people and find some people and let them know that it's all good. There's people in every single one of our lives, and you got to know, it's not all good because what they said was okay, or because what they did was okay. No, what they said was wrong. What they did was dirty. We didn't deserve it. Well then, Alex, why in the world is it all good? It's all good because when we said what wasn't okay, and when what we did wasn't okay, Jesus died for us anyways, and then he rose again to come back and let us know that you treated me wrong, but I forgive you anyways. It's all good. You're free. You're off the hook. Come on. Can we lift up our voices and just bask in the love of God for a few moments?
Hey guys, thanks so much for tuning in with us today. We hope this message blessed you and encouraged you. If you don't subscribe to our YouTube channel, be sure to do that. Click subscribe below. If you don't like our page on Facebook or follow us on Instagram, be sure to do that too. And if you want to give into the move of God happening here at Overflow Church, all you got to do is go to overflowchurchonline.com and it'll walk you through the steps. So we love you guys. We appreciate you tuning in with us. Have an incredible day.